you mind if I talk for a while about something that I absolutely love? Hippie with a machete. Company knew they suckered me when they made it look like an elven sword. And while you work your fields, do not forget the woods. The woods stand by the field, to measure it and teach its keeper. Nature is the best farmer, for she preserves the land, conserves the rain, she deepens the soil, wastes nothing, and she is diverse and orderly. She is our mother, teacher, and final judge on earth. The farm's a human order, opening among the trees, remembering the woods. To farm, live like a tree that does not grow beyond the power of its place. A tree stands in its place and rises by the strength of local soil and light, aspiring to no height that it has not attained. More time, more light, more rain will make it grow again, till it has realized all that it can become. And then it dies into more life, deserving more, but not desiring more. That is from The Farm by Wendell, one of my absolutely favorite poems. So, as long as I can remember, I have loved the woods and the forest and the fields. When I was in elementary school, they gave me a personality test, and one of the questions started with something along the lines of, sometimes I think about, and I answered it, disappearing into the forest and never coming out. And by the way, there is still a very distinct possibility that at some point in this life I will do exactly that. Not like in a suicide-y way, just in a way like, I'm done with you people. And, I already did it once when I had my quarter-life crisis, and I hiked the Appalachian Trail, Maine to Georgia. So I had spent, for those of you who don't know, my name is Brenton Lengel. I am a poet, a playwright. I've had 7 plays produced in New York City. I'm an author, and I am also the creator of the Ringo-Nominated series, Snow White Zombie Apocalypse. And I thought we'd come out here to this place that I love, because, when things get really nuts in the world of man, I tend to disappear into the world of nature. When I hiked the Appalachian Trail, the 6 months I spent in the woods, really 5.5, was just as the 2008 financial crisis was hitting us. And I remembered every time I'd come off the mountain, I'd walk into town and find everybody glued to their TVs and their screens, freaking the heck out. And, I'd just be like, oh, okay, I'm just going to go back into the woods. And interestingly enough, it's something that has kind of stuck with me. Because when you live like that, when you have nothing, literally everything that you own, you carry on your back, you brag about how little you have, like we literally used to compete over who would have less. Anything that didn't have 2 purposes, we would throw away. That was the life of the Thru-Hiker. And we survived on random acts of kindness from strangers. It's called trail magic. Oftentimes, when I have conversations about anarchism, I come back to this. Because really, the way that Thru-Hikers live on the Appalachian Trail is inherently anarchistic. Because the forest is inherently anarchistic. That is what the wilderness is. If you look around, there's no one managing this for the most part. And when people do try to manage it, when people come through and they clear paths or cut vines that are climbing up trees, nature rebels and continues to assert itself, despite not really trying to do that, because you kind of have to have a conscious mind to try to do something, whereas nature just simply is. In fact, that's what the Chinese call it. That which is of itself is nature. And the fact of the matter is that man is nature. And it's very strange that every time I talk about this, even with other anarchists, like, I get accused of being a primitivist. And I am not at all a primitivist, you know. There are certainly some, you know, I think I might fit a little bit into green anarchism because of my vision of the life that I encountered on the Appalachian Trail, the life where I was essentially living a more modern version of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And it's one of the reasons why I will often appeal to the hunter-gatherer lifestyle in debates. Because I'll tell you, those 5.5 months where I was walking 2,200 miles from Georgia to Maine were some of the happiest of my life. And I will probably wind up going back and doing it again. I may even one of these days do the Triple Crown, where I spend a year where I walk the Appalachian Trail, the CDT, and the PCT, Continental Divide Trail and Pacific Crest Trail. Do all three, end to end. Maybe take the family with that. That'll be great. It'll give the kids something to talk to their therapists about. But I think that one of the big issues that a lot of people have with anarchist and libertarian philosophy is they're like, prove that it works. Prove that freedom actually gets us what we want. And, I mean, it's working. It's working everywhere. Humans have this need to straighten things out. Like, Alan Watts talks about how life is inherently wiggly. It's a vibration, you know, be it sound waves or, waves of light or photons, and light jumping between the photon and the wave. And the sort of personality of someone who is deeply involved in the social game, who's deeply involved in the world of men and women, but unfortunately at the moment, men mostly run things and we do a terrible job of it. I'm sorry. Not my fault, but I'm still sorry about the situation. But really, what we create in civilization, in a lot of ways, is a lot of great things. Medical science. My wife would not be around without medical science. You know, my son might not, because he was born 6 weeks early. My father's a doctor, and, you know, I would not be as healthy as I am without medical science. You know, I was born and developed asthma and severe allergies, and I've come through them, partially through immunotherapy and a number of other things, to where I can do crazy stuff, like hike the Appalachian Trail, Maine to Georgia. And we gained a lot when we set up our human hives and we built the farm and then the cities and then moved further and further to where we felt safer and safer outside of nature. To the point to where people still think of nature as a very dangerous place. I remember when I first told people I was going to hike the Appalachian Trail, the first thing a lot of people said is, "Are you going to bring a gun?" And I said, "No." Because guns are heavy, they're illegal in a lot of places, and you don't really need them. Mostly, but like the worst thing that guns do in the wilderness, you know, unless you're like up in Antarctica or Greenland, which I may go very soon. I've done hikes in Iceland, and the Arctic Circle Trail in Greenland sounds really good to me. But I might, if I go up that way, I may be carrying a rifle because polar bears. But the point is that when you don't need a gun and you're carrying one, it affects you. It affects the way that you think. It gives a frame to everything. Because when you're carrying a gun, you're always waiting for a chance to use that gun. You're always waiting for that bear or that psycho. Oftentimes I find people that concealed carry in the wilderness are more afraid, more closed off, and more suspicious. And maybe that's why they're carrying the gun in the first place. But I think a lot of it is also just the simple act of carrying one with you. And I don't mean for this to be a rant against weapons. I mean, I came out here, this isn't really a weapon. I mainly brought this along because I hate walking into spider webs, and I didn't want to carry a stick. So, but anyway, I guess what I'm getting at is that when we moved from the forest to the farm and the farm to the city, we lost something. And as this society grew up around us and people are born into it and born not in the forest, but in the city, there is a disconnect. There is a series of values that are imposed upon the human mind and the human soul from the time that we're born. It's, in a lot of ways, a frame, like the frame that I mentioned that's created by the gun. Or if you look at my debate about faith with Armin of Atheist Republic, which is posted right before this, I talked about the frame that Western Enlightenment values often create, where we see ourselves as separate from nature and separate from the world and separate even from our own bodies. Like we're a ghost driving our body, and our body is a piece of technology. And you see that when a kid asks his parents, like, how was I made? Well, you weren't made. You grew. People say, like, I came into this world. No, you didn't. You came out of it. And eventually you will go back into it. And everybody's really afraid of this, despite, that's what literally everything does all the time. And it's fine, I've got a flock of chickens that I've been raising, and it occurred to me that, as they've been laying their eggs and as I've been eating those eggs, in a way, me and the chickens are connected. They produce the eggs, I eat them, the eggs become me. And so you really can't draw this like hard and fast distinction between man and the natural world. And you can't say that that which conquers nature is inherently good, or even that which is natural is inherently good, because good and bad are human judgments. But the fact is that I think what anarchists really need to realize, especially if you are one of the more social constructivist-leaning anarchists, if you're coming from like the anarcho-communist tradition, for instance, but you're less on the Bookchin end of the anarcho-communist tradition, and you're more the Prince Kropotkin end. And the Prince Kropotkin end is great, and in fact he was a zoologist, so he definitely had a respect and admiration for nature, and that informed a lot of his views and why he believes deep down that, mankind is born free and needs to be freed from the trap that we have built for ourselves over generations. We built this grand cage to keep us safe from something that is ultimately us. Any and all lines are very arbitrary, and leftists should be able to understand this because we understand spectrum. We understand that, the line between genders is socially constructed. We understand the lines between races are socially constructed. What we need to also understand is the lines between individuals are socially constructed, and species, and even, us and our environment. Because ultimately, viewing ourselves as a separate ego in this body, and this is where I'm getting a little more into Buddhism than anarchism, it's not incorrect, but it's just one way to look at things, and there are benefits and drawbacks to looking at it in this way all the time. So, I suppose the question then becomes, what do we do with this? What do we do with the world that we built, with the cage that we built around us, especially when elements of that cage really stop doing what they're supposed to do and stop defending us and start actively hurting us, in much the same way that the police who murdered, and I'm saying murdered, Breonna Taylor, were supposed to protect her. Now, I know that, there's criticisms of the police that I find very compelling, that the police's real purpose is not what most people believe, that in fact they exist only to defend property and to enforce the hegemony of the state on the behalf of the state's primary constituents, which are the wealthy, the powerful, the elite, the capitalists. And that is also correct, but I think it's also not the whole truth, and we need to reckon with the fact that those who built the human machine that is society, it wasn't built with a single will or a single purpose in mind. And many of the people that built our civilization had the best of intentions. And some had the worst of intentions, and some didn't really even think that hard about it, just did what seemed right and felt right. But I think what has been lost in our exodus from the wild and in our desire to tame all wildness in service to, I guess, a feeling of safety, is that these behaviors can easily be seen as a method to manage anxiety about our own inevitable death. I think ultimately, if you look at someone like Donald Trump, there is, on a deep level, he's a narcissist because, in my opinion, his father didn't love him, and he was deeply injured by that. He was also deeply injured by the privilege that he grew up in, and by being isolated from everyone and told he was better than everyone from the time he was a very young child. And so he has gone at life with this insane need to be noticed and lauded and sake his gluttony and his lust, because ultimately what you have inside that man is a very frightened, sad, and pathetic individual. Oftentimes, I think about what it must be like to be Donald Trump and to live inside his head, if we are to borrow that metaphor, to have that reality around you. And I legitimately shudder, The conservatives and the same will say, Trump derangement syndrome, because they just say that anytime he gets criticized in any way, shape, or form. But it's genuinely been my reaction to that man from the time before he was president, before he was even on there. You look at the Sabo cat, or the cat that hisses at the vampire in the room. That's me. Every time I saw him, from the time I was a little kid on up, was just unclean. Because on a certain level, I think I picked up on who he actually was. And a lot of people, sadly, haven't picked up on that for any number of reasons, very frustrating reasons. But again, what I want to keep coming back to is the forest. The wild anarchy of the forest. And I'm not saying we live in this exact wild anarchy, but I'm saying there are some definite positives in this way of living and there are some definite negatives that we see in the inverse, in the human world, the human community, the polis. We can see it in what politics does to people and what politicians, most if not all, become if they weren't that to begin with. I think when I think about my ideal society, one of the first and most important things that comes to mind is conservation. Because I love this. And I want my son and any of my other children that I may have to grow up in this and to live not exactly like I lived, but to have the advantages of disappearing into the forest at times, to be alone and to feel the silence blossom on their tongue, like their own silent language. There's really something about the smell. And there's also something about just the process of life becoming more life. Because even when you cut the vines that we see growing up the trees, and this spares the trees at the cost of the vines sprout new stems and wind onto their old dead stems and climb up into the tree line. And sometimes they live in fairly decent balance with the tree, and sometimes they choke the tree, and the tree collapses and the vine moves on. It's a horrifying story seen from one vantage point, but from another, it's intensely beautiful. Because what both of them are doing really is reaching for the sun and seeking to become themselves, at least until they are fully themselves, at which point they collapse into more life, and the cycle begins again. So I guess what I want to leave you guys with is, if you want to think about my ideal civilization, it would be one where we don't deny this, where we don't try to cover it up with laws and machines and convenience, but one where we are one with our surroundings, and we live long, full, happy lives that are filled with interesting diversions and amazing accomplishments. I often think if you took the best aspects of the Federation in Star Trek and combined them with the elves of Rivendell, and then you gave it a dose of human wildness, of our wayward spirit, I think that's the most ideal place, at least for me, and at my most utopian, that's what I dream of. And I hope after watching this video, that'll be something you dream of too. Or if you don't, I hope you give it a little bit of thought. Make it a part of you.
The captain said to ford the river, and that's how it all begun. And we was waist deep in the big muddy, and the big fool said to push on.